So it's really challenging to make decisions in finance or really any other discipline without thinking about the geopolitical environment that we all exist in. And it hasn't been more complicated, I don't think, in a long, long time, certainly in my lifetime. And every time Andy and I talk about this conference, we say we have to get a really important speaker to talk to us about the geopolitical environment. And I'm thrilled to introduce and actually welcome back Meghan O'Sullivan. Some of you may remember she was here with us before COVID, and the world's changed a lot since then, and we're anxious to hear about it. So, few have had the same impact and influence on foreign policy as Meghan O'Sullivan through the past 3 decades. She's advised the nation's highest-ranking leaders, including serving as a special assistant to President George W. Bush and working under Secretary of State Colin Powell. Among her career accomplishments, she oversaw the direction and execution of new policy directions in Iraq and Afghanistan and helped usher in a new U.S. strategy towards Iraq known as the Surge, which many of us have read about. Today, she's the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of Practice of International Affairs and the Director of the Geopolitics of Energy Project at Harvard University's Kennedy School. Beginning on July 1st, she will succeed the late former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter as the Director of Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Some of you were here last year where we had the privilege of hearing from Secretary Carter and his prescient words about the war in Ukraine, and it would likely be a long slog, and how correct he was in his assessment. The Belfer Center is consistently ranked as the top academic think tank in the world. She's also a member of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's Foreign Policy Advisory Board and the recipient of numerous awards from the Pentagon and State Department for her public service. On top of her standing as one of the world's leading geopolitical advisors, she's served on the board of Raytheon Technologies and is currently on the board of the Council of Foreign Relations, among various other board and committee roles. She's the award-winning author of Windfall and several other books. Esquire magazine called her one of this century's most influential people. And now, please join me in welcoming Meghan O'Sullivan.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Dan, for that introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be with all of you this morning. I had travel hiccups, so I didn't get to hear Malcolm Gladwell. But I think maybe that is good, because he might be a very hard act to follow. So, but fortunately, I have a very engaging topic to talk to you about. And that is the state of the world. You've probably heard others talk about that we're coming to the end of a really benign environment. For the last 30 years, although maybe we didn't fully appreciate it at the time, but for the last 30 years, we were in a relatively benign environment. Now we're moving into another place. A lot of people refer to this moment as an inflection point. That kind of captures the sense that we're at a critical moment. But I think it is misleading to refer to this moment as an inflection point for a whole range of reasons. An inflection point suggests everything shifts, and then we're accommodating ourselves to a new norm. Were it that easy? The reality, I think, is a lot more complicated, and that is that we're really experiencing what I describe as 5 different interlocking transitions. And these transitions will go on for years. Many of them will go on for decades. So what I would like to do today is to talk to you about those 5 interlocking transitions, and then talk just a little bit about the implications, particularly the implications for business of these trends. So the first transition I want to talk to you about is that from cooperation to great power competition. So again, the last 30 years were one that were largely characterized by a benign international environment where the norms and the values and the institutions that were created by the United States and its allies were largely the ones that countries that wanted to be part of the global economy, wanted to benefit from the prosperity that came with it, kind of signed up to. And this led to an unprecedented period of prosperity and relative peace. And during those last 30 years, it wasn't that other countries were completely on the sidelines, but they were consumed with other things. It was a tumultuous few decades for Russia, as we know, as it recovered or tried to seek a new path forward after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And China, for its part, was very much consumed with domestic issues, taking the last 30 years to bring about 300 million people out of poverty, and really focused on meeting the needs of its people. So what changed? I'd say a few things changed. On the US side, we had a response to 9/11. We had interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan that were incredibly costly. As Dan mentioned, I was involved in some of those. I'm happy to take questions about those. I spent 2 years in Iraq working with the Iraqis to try to rebuild their institutions after the fall of Saddam. Those interventions were costly, as I said, but one of the costs that was very significant was the credibility of the United States and its standing in the world. We also had the financial crisis, which again called into question America's financial model and its role as being an economy that you wanted to emulate. And then Americans increasingly looked inward, and that was reflected in the election of Donald Trump as president in 2016. All of these things came together to make the United States a little bit more insular, a little bit less dominant, not a little bit, a lot less dominant on the global stage. At the same time, there were things happening in China. You had the end of the experiment of trying to see, and this is quite recently, trying to see if integrating China into the global economy could actually curb the biggest excesses of a state-dominated economy. And that, as we've discovered, turned out not to work. That was not a gamble. It was a calculated strategy that Republican and Democratic governments in Washington took over the course of multiple decades. And it was only, I would say, in the last 5 or 6 years that people came to realize that this integration was hugely to China's benefit, but less so to the rest of the world. And that was coupled with the rise of Xi Jinping, who is an extraordinary Chinese leader and one who departed from the leadership directions of the last several generations of Chinese presidents and decided that actually it was no longer appropriate or fitting for China to just focus on its domestic problems, but that it was time for China to take on a global role. And he and his rule really catapulted China onto the global stage in a way that we had not seen it for really centuries. So we have these things come together, and where does it put us now? It moves us away from that benign environment I talked about, moves us from that cooperative global period to one of great power competition. And so just to move us really to the news and the headlines and what is the state of this actual great power competition, I'd say it's not an exaggeration that literally in my formative years as a foreign policy person, the absence of great power competition was one of the most remarkable features of the system. Now, the great power competition is real in the sense that we see it play out in multiple ways every day, and with it comes a real risk of potential great power conflict. So let's talk about Ukraine for a moment. Here is a situation where the United States is not at war with Russia, but Russia actually sees itself as being at war with Europe and with the United States. And while the conflict has remarkably been contained to the Ukraine theater, there's always the nervousness and the possibility that this conflict could become greater than it is now. As Dan mentioned, my former colleague Ash Carter told you last year, this is a war that's going to slog on for some time. And I'm here to throw a little bit more cold water. I don't want to be pessimistic, but if you're listening to the news and following this conflict right now, you probably are hearing people say, Well, actually, 2023 is going to be a period where we're hoping that we can move to a peace agreement. There is a counteroffensive being prepared by the Ukrainians right now. It will probably start in the next week or two. And the hope is that at the end of this counteroffensive, there'll be a concerted effort to bring the two parties to the negotiating table and come to some kind of agreement. This certainly is where we should be heading, I would say, at this point in the conflict, looking to move this out of the military realm into the diplomatic realm. The reality is, I think it's a little over-optimistic to think that in this counteroffensive, we reach some kind of sweet spot. Because think about it, what we're actually looking for is the Ukrainians to do well enough that their hand is strengthened at a negotiating table. But we don't want them to do so well that they don't want to negotiate. They want to keep on reclaiming territory on the battlefield. Similarly, we want the Ukrainians to do well enough that Vladimir Putin feels like he needs to come to the negotiating table, but not so well that Vladimir Putin feels like he needs to escalate this conflict in a way to dramatically change the course of the conflict. So that's a very narrow road to maneuver. Hopefully that's where the world will go. But my expectation is we're not looking at a peace agreement in the near term. We're looking, hopefully, the best case scenario is an armistice, more akin to what we have in North Korea, where there hasn't been a peace agreement since the Korean War. So something where there would be continued uncertainty about the status of Ukraine, about the Russian presence in Ukraine, and perhaps most consequential for this trend I'm talking about is a Russia that will continue to be divorced from the West. And I think over time, that will become a huge issue in the global economy and a huge issue on the political landscape. So that's a little bit of one facet of this great power competition we're seeing. The other, of course, is the US-China relationship. We've had some good news, I would say, in the last 48 hours, in the sense that you had the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, go to London and meet with a Chinese former foreign minister for 8 hours. And apparently their conversation, if what I hear is correct, was largely about the relationship. And that's the kind of conversation that we should be having, like how to envision this relationship in a way that doesn't lead to conflict going forward. I think the days where the US and China were able to cooperate actively on things like Iran, North Korea, climate, it wasn't that long ago. It was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Those days are probably in the rearview mirror for the foreseeable future. But the question is, can both sides find some modus vivendi where this competition, which is leading into every aspect of the international system, can be limited to competition and not move to conflict? And there are many different things that could trigger. We've seen over the last year or so, I would say, not even a year, since Nancy Pelosi's visit, the speaker's visit last August, lots of ups and downs in this relationship. Speaker Pelosi's visit, a very aggressive response by the Chinese, then the balloons floating over the United States, canceled visits, a summit between the two leaders, things get better, things get worse. The question is, can there be some ground? Can there be a floor put under the relationship where it doesn't crash through that floor? But these are the big questions for this trend, and as I said, we're in a very dynamic situation. This is going to evolve over time. The second trend is from integration to fragmentation. And again, this is kind of reflective of a more copacetic world, where for the last 30 years, there was a steady move in the direction of more integration of trade, or of countries through trade mechanisms, trade treaties, moving from regional trade treaties to more global trade treaties, having global institutions like the WTO that help facilitate this, the free flow of data, people, investment alongside trade, the emphasis on efficiency, on just-in-time, on specialization. All of those things made the global economy work very efficiently and made this an environment that was largely a deflationary environment and one of generally low interest rates. That environment is being severely challenged right now. I'd say, though, in this transition, we're probably, in the early part of this transition. We don't know exactly the direction it's going to go. It's being driven by a number of things. I mean, first of all, COVID and the reaction to supply chain vulnerability, like a very clear movement away from being vulnerable to the policies of other countries on anything that is seen as being in the national interest, broadly defined. That has been a big driver of changing supply chains. But also this great power competition is a huge driver of changing these supply chains. In a moment, I'll talk about the energy transition, but one great example is the critical minerals industry. That over the previous 30 years, the world was pretty content to let China dominate the supply chains for things like lithium and copper and cobalt and all of these minerals. The world was happy to do that, one, because the strategic value of those minerals was important but fairly narrowly applicable, but also because not just mining, but mostly processing and refining these minerals turns out to be very environmentally unfriendly. And the Chinese were willing to take those environmental costs, and they were willing to produce and refine those minerals at a cost that was so low the rest of the world wasn't able to match it. And so what we find now is that the world is in a place where the overwhelming majority of critical minerals that are needed for the global economy, and particularly needed for the clean energy transition, are concentrated in China. And so the supply chain, going back to this fragmentation, so the desire is not to be vulnerable, not to be overly dependent, and it plays into the great power competition transition. All of these, as I said, are interlocking. So you have the great power competition reinforcing the move away from integration towards fragmentation. And we've started to see it in the numbers between the US and China in terms of foreign direct investment flows slowing down a little bit, the United States importing a little less from China than it did before. There's uncertainty what this decoupling is going to look like. If you're somebody who spends a lot of time on the White House website, you would see the speeches, 2 very significant speeches in the last 2 weeks, trying to lay out the intellectual foundation of the Biden administration's policy towards China. You had Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, give a talk where she tried to define, this is where we're going to compete. This is where we're going to disengage, we're going to decouple, and this is where we're going to allow the rest of the economy to continue to be interdependent. It's a very nice and neat terminology. In practice, it will be harder to keep these baskets separate, but at least it is an articulation of a strategy that is now referred to in Washington as small yards with high fences, trying to discern a relatively small amount of the economies that just can't be vulnerable to Chinese policy making or whims of a politician, and the Chinese feel the same way. So that area is going to be decoupled. Whether or not our politics, their politics, will allow us to keep the other areas open to trade and investment is the big question, which will help define how significant this move towards fragmentation is. Okay, the third transition I want to talk about is that from fossil fuels to net zero. I should really be more precise. It's actually not fossil fuels, it's the carbon emissions associated with fossil fuels. And in fact, if you look at any projection in the future, well, projections are in the future by agencies, companies, and others about what the global economy might look like when it reaches net zero, there's still a healthy, depending on healthy might not be might be a subjective adjective, there's still a considerable amount of oil and gas in those energy mixes, net zero. Because every scenario you look at, this scenario here is actually just for the electricity grid. So I'm talking about the whole global economy now, transportation as well. Every global scenario says we can only get to where we need to be in the eyes of climate scientists by 2050, or by really any decade, if we find a way to capture the carbon associated with a certain amount of use of oil and gas. And that is because there are sectors of the economy that are going to still require that. So the net zero is going to involve the maturation and commercialization of technologies like carbon capture and use. So if we're able to separate fossil fuels from carbon emissions, the energy transition is going to look a lot better, which is why I'm just correcting myself when I say fossil fuels to net zero. So this, as everyone in this room will be aware, this is going to be one of the big imperatives of the next several decades. We know from the IPCC, the UN International Panel for Climate Change, that the world has already warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius beyond pre-industrial times. And that's in a bandwidth where the same scientists and much of the global political leadership agree that 1.5, we don't want to warm the temperature more than 1.5 degrees. We've already warmed at 1.1. There are almost 200 countries who have signed up to take action to try to get their economies to net zero. And I emphasize signed up. Very, very few of them have actual plans for doing so. So there is a desire to move us in that direction, but not yet action plans to do so. And the most recent IPCC report said that if we stay on the trajectory we're on, we're going to see the globe warm to 3.2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. So there's a lot to be done here, and a lot has been done. Last year was the first year that you had investment in clean energy outstripping investment in fossil fuels. So you do have hundreds of billions of dollars of investment around the world occurring every year in this segment. And you do see lots of policy innovations. But the reality is we haven't even really begun to transition. Despite all the talk, despite all the work, despite all the investment, actually the world is still emitting more carbon every year. And demand for oil and gas, unmitigated with their carbon emissions, is still rising. So we are looking more like the old energy transitions of the past, where we never actually stopped, we never used less coal, we just used more of other stuff. So as energy demand grew, we just met growing energy demand with new sources of energy. We can't do that in this transition because of the carbon intensity of coal and other fossil fuels. So we need to find a way to displace those energy sources. And thus far, the world is using almost as much coal today as it has ever used in the history of the world. So the challenges are real. And this will be the imperative of policymakers going forward. So I want to separate out a few things as I talk about this particular transition. The first thing is, we could have a conversation, and I've been involved with a lot of conversations in different venues about whether the world is going to get to net zero by 2050. I think there are a lot of questions around that, but it doesn't diminish the imperative. So that's one conversation. The conversation that I want to focus on today is that whether or not we get to net zero, or maybe there are people here who don't think we need to get to net zero, whatever your view is on this, the geopolitical reality is this effort to get to net zero is going to be one of the biggest geopolitical resets of the century. And what I mean by that is, you think, we're 23 years into the century, we've had 3 geopolitical resets, 9/11, COVID, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that have reordered relationships, economics, This transition, this energy transition, is going to dwarf all of those transitions, because the efforts that governments and businesses and foundations and individuals are going to make to try to get to net zero, regardless of whether A, we need to get there, and B, whether we will get there, the efforts that people and governments and others are going to make to move in that direction, or to try to thwart that transition, if they have interests that are in a different category, are going to be some of the most defining actions. And it's very interesting to see that the Biden administration has already begun to try very hard to put climate at the center of its domestic policy and its foreign policy. I was actually pretty skeptical when the president came into office that it was going to be doable to make climate at the center of foreign policy. As somebody who'd been working in foreign policy for decades, I said, foreign policy people are not climate people. To get foreign policy people to think, I'm going to write a memo to the president before he meets with King so-and-so, and I'm going to say there are 3 issues you need to raise to make sure that climate is one of those issues, was going to be an uphill battle. But I think the Biden administration, it's still a work in progress. They've actually done quite a good job of transforming the American foreign policy to make climate one of the central elements. It's also been helped by the fact that the rest of the world is now escalating or elevating the way that climate is in their interactions with the United States. If you look at the developing world, this is one of the primary issues that is raised with the United States and with other countries all over the world. Think about Pakistan and the floods that country endured, which are contributing to the political crisis that is underway right now in Pakistan. So that's the first big point to keep in mind about this transition. You can be agnostic about a number of things about climate, but if you're looking at this from a geopolitical, business, political, or economic perspective, this is a trend that is going to be very meaningful, because there are going to be such incredible efforts to try to move the global economy in this direction. This is not just substituting one source of energy for another. It's remaking the entire global energy system, and it's doing so in an incredibly short period of time. The other thing I'd mention about this trend is that I talked about how all of these 5 trends are interlocking. There are so many interlocking elements of this trend with the other 2 that I just mentioned. So first, let me just give you the example of how the move to great power competition and the energy transition are connecting in the global sphere. So take Vladimir Putin and his decision to invade Ukraine. I believe, or to invade it again, I should say, just this past 18 months or so ago. I'm a firm believer that his greatest impetus here was to reset the European security architecture, and because of his belief, his core belief, that Ukraine should be part of Russia. However, the energy landscape in this transition really worked in his favor. And I'll describe what I mean by that. There had been a disconnect, which is still growing and is actually a big business opportunity, depending on your lens, but a growing disconnect between the amount of investment being put in oil and gas and the continued growth of demand for oil and gas in the world. And so many investors are reluctant to invest in oil and gas for climate reasons. And also because this sector, it's hard to remember, but just a few years ago, this sector was giving pretty paltry returns. So you had a real diminution in the investment in oil and gas. At the same time, the world was asking for more oil and gas every year. Demand's still growing. So the distance between supply and demand was getting greater and greater. And this gave Vladimir Putin enormous leverage. So these very tight energy markets made it very advantageous for him when he invaded Ukraine, because the tight energy markets and the fact that there already had been an energy crisis in Europe before the invasion meant that the rest of the world was and has been, to some extent, constrained in the way that it can respond to Russia because of Russia's dominant role in the global energy system and because of this tension between supply and demand and the tightness of the markets. So that's one way that this great power competition and this energy transition are influencing one another. Another important example is that we really just need to think about the energy transition differently in light of the first transition of great power competition. For, I would say now, 27 years, think about the Conference of the Parties, the COP, the Climate Change Annual Conference that started 27 years ago. It was very sensible, I think, for global leaders to say, this is a transnational problem. It demands global cooperation. No one country can solve it on its own. Therefore, the answer to this challenge is going to be cooperation at a global level. And hence, the Conference of the Parties, the COP, started to come into effect. We've now had 27 of them. It's a meaningful mechanism, continues to fall short, but it is the venue in which the world has put so much of its hopes and efforts into meeting the challenge of the energy transition and climate change. In this global environment, which is dominated by competitive vibes, not cooperative ones, we have to think again about how we're tackling the energy transition. To me, it is folly to think that we can meet our climate needs or energy transition ambitions solely through a cooperative mechanism when the dominant force in global politics is now this competitive one. That we have to figure out how to harness the competition to get to our goals, rather than to hope that this issue of climate is going to somehow remain an island of cooperation in an otherwise sea of conflict and competition. So again, a lot of interlocking aspects between these trends. Okay, this is a little more complicated of a slide, but again, one of the fourth trends, very much related to the other ones, is this move away from more of a free market attitude, a more liberal market attitude towards ones of government dominance or government intervention. It's a huge trend that I think is very much going to accelerate. And because if you think of the priorities that we can infer from the other transitions I talked about, these actually require more government intervention to move the economy, and in some cases society, to places that the markets would not take them naturally. So a good example, I mean, first I think we started to acculturate ourselves to this idea under COVID, where in that kind of crisis, people look to government to provide the answers. It was striking to me as somebody who has worked for Republicans to see so many Republicans looking to the government to help solve the crisis. So we started to change our thinking about that. But now, in light of the trends that I just mentioned, the great power competition, the fragmentation, and the energy transition, again, markets are not going to get us where our governments want us to be without a pretty heavy hand of the government, and that's what we've started to see. So again, markets are going to have a big role in the energy transition. Markets will be fundamental to any successful transition, but given that there is a time frame and an urgency associated with it, there needs to be more signals from policy. And so you see how government has become a lot more involved. The screenshot here, or this slide, talks about the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is the first very substantial action that the American federal government has taken towards the challenge of climate change. It's somewhere, people are now thinking that this could end up amounting to $1.2 trillion over 10 years because a lot of the tax incentives are not capped in this bill. But this is a huge effort on the part of the US government to send incentives and price signals and tax incentives to try to get the kinds of investment and the movement into sectors that will make the energy transition possible. This really flies in the face of decades of advice by economists who said the best way to transition your economy away from high carbon energy is to put a price on carbon. that had been, that continues to be, I think, the mind of many of us, the most efficient way to make this transition. The politics of the United States just don't seem to allow for that, at least not now. And so how has our government decided it would move our economy and society in this direction? Is by incentivizing, by just putting a lot of money in front of the problem. And so that's one government intervention. But also, these interventions having to do with fragmentation, the discomfort with having supply chains that are interwoven with China, getting companies and other countries to become involved in supply chains. This is something that the government, again, is putting a lot of effort into creating an environment in which this will happen. So if you think about, you've probably heard the term friendshoring or allied shoring or reshoring. It's basically encouraging companies to move their supply chains from China or to replicate them, to do so in the environment where we have more friendly political relationships. Some of it will come back to the United States directly, but some of this investment is being encouraged to go to North America. Some of it's being encouraged to go to other countries that have minerals or lower cost labor. But again, it's the government jumping in to send those signals to try to influence and expedite these transitions. And then in the great power competition, the government intervention is huge because technology is the biggest part of the US-China competition. The US and China are competing on all kinds of levels, but I'd say at the heart of it, this is a competition for technological dominance because both countries have figured out that if you are technologically dominant, you will be militarily dominant and economically dominant. And so the government has adopted a strategy of making enormous investments in American competitiveness in some of these areas. So again, all of these things, which I believe are trends that are beginning, are going to accumulate over the course of these transitions. So the trend towards friendshoring, believe will be one of the dominant moves of the next several decades when it comes to some of these issues in supply chains. If you think about the investment in technology, this too, I think, will continue. We are now in an age of industrial strategy, and it's not just the United States. The rest of the world is also responding to US policy and trying to figure out how they can still be competitive in a world where the United States has recreated the investment landscape in a way that makes it more attractive to invest here and less attractive to invest there. So again, it's not just understanding the industrial strategy of the United States, but it's understanding the responses of other countries that are reshaping some of these transitions and trends. Okay, here's the last trend, and the one I am not too embarrassed to tell you I know the least about, but certainly thinking about trends for the next 20 years, we can't leave out technology. And this phrase, from human intelligence to artificial intelligence, I know is a little provocative, but it is simply the idea that as I have spoken with more and more people about AI in particular, but technology in general, I would say the conservative side of the House, and there are people here, Dan being among them, that know this much better. The conservative side of the House says these technologies are going to change the way we think, they're going to change our relationships, they're going to change the way we play and the way we work. And so if that's the conservative side of the House, that's still a very big change. On the other, less conservative, more, I don't want to put a value judgment on it, but people who think this is going to be even more transformative, I put Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt in this category. These are people who think that this technology is going to alter human consciousness. That essentially, they paint a picture that we have machines that over time tell us what to do And it turns out what they tell us to do gets us the outcome that we're looking for. We ask them how to get to an outcome. They tell us what to do. The big gap right now is that we don't understand how AI is getting to the answers that it's offering us. So as Kissinger actually described it to me not long ago, he said, we are increasingly opening the gap between human knowledge and human understanding. And so the concern is that at some point, a decade out, who knows how fast this technology is going to evolve, that we'll be in a situation where leaders, business people, others in many walks of life will be taking the advice of computers, not knowing why or how that direction has been come to, but executing on that. And that is a very, very different way of living, working, playing, and thinking. So let me just now, I'm leaving 15 minutes so we can have a discussion, because I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts and questions about either things I've mentioned or other geopolitical trends. Let me talk a little bit about some of the implications. I'm conscious this is a finance conference, and I tried to think about looking at these 5 interlocking transitions. What are some of the implications, for governments and individuals, but particularly for businesses? So I have a few that I can go through at a greater pace. The first is that these transitions are inherently inflationary. We can talk about that the inflation in the short term now looks like it's coming under greater control, and I'm sure there are many interesting conversations that you might be even having at this conference about this. My point is these transitions are a decade, 2 decades long, and all of them, or most of them, are inflationary. You think about the energy transition, there's different price tags on it, but a commonly accepted one is that the energy transition in the next several decades will require $100 trillion of investment in infrastructure all around the world. A country like Nigeria on its own requiring $190 billion to get its infrastructure to be compatible with a clean energy future. So we're talking about huge levels of investment, and in some cases, creating redundancies. So that's one example, but of course, recreating supply chains that in an apolitical world would work just fine, that's also inflationary. Think about the IRA legislation that I just mentioned, putting potentially $1 trillion in 10 years into largely infrastructure-related things. You think about the CHIPS Act, all of these things are inflationary. So that's the first thing I would mention. Now, of course, as people in business know very well, it's not, are we in an inflationary environment or are we in a non-inflationary environment? The question is, how inflationary is it? How persistent is it? Is this I'm saying it's a secular trend, but how dramatic a trend is it? It depends on understanding the dynamics of these different transitions. And as I described to you, there's a lot of uncertainty on the US-China relationship, and that will be a huge driver of how extreme the decoupling scenario is, how inflationary that is for the global economy, whether the world really expedites its efforts to invest in clean energy. Again, that becomes more or less inflationary. There, I would just highlight the challenge of the developing world, that the big challenge, or the thing that people are trying to figure out, is how to get trillions and trillions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars into developing economies so that they can build clean energy infrastructure. So all of these things, understanding just how significant these transitions are and how they're unfolding will affect just how much this is an inflationary environment and the location of new opportunities. Geopolitics are not a sideshow. I know that in the past, I've spoken to some business audiences, And some of them have said, you know, actually geopolitics, it can make a big bang, but then things usually settle out. So if you're a long-term investor, you don't have to watch geopolitics this much because, you know, things kind of even out. Well, my thesis is that's probably true in a deflationary or a low inflation environment. In this kind of environment that I've been describing to you, geopolitical shocks are going to have a lot more impact. First of all, there are going to be more of the geopolitical shocks for the reasons that I've laid out. But secondly, in a global economy like I'm describing, it is going to be more vulnerable to geopolitical shocks. There's just less resilience in the economy. And whether that be, these are just some of the things that we might see in the coming years. This, of course, is Taiwan. Happy to talk about that if we have any questions about this. This is a picture of the current situation in Pakistan. And then up top, we have North Korea. That these are shocks that the global economy will find harder to deal with than in, you know, the previous 30 years. So this is kind of summing it up a little bit, but understanding the benefits and the risks associated with different investment flows has a lot today to do with government policy in this world of increasing government intervention, the responses of other government policy to US policy, and strategic imperatives. That those things are the things that are really shaping the global economy and shaping not just risks. I think it sounds like I've been talking a lot about risks, and I have, but also opportunities. All of these things that I mentioned create enormous opportunities in a wide variety of sectors. If you think about redoing supply chains, this creates enormous opportunities, particularly if you're in logistics or you're in infrastructure. There are going to be big opportunities and big imperatives that are going to be funded by governments, and governments are going to be looking for ways to incentivize flows of private capital. So understanding all of these things now becomes more central to success in the global economy. And then I'll end almost exactly on time with just this statement, which is that the world is moving to a place where it will be impossible to maximize your successes or minimize your failures in the world of business, but also I can say this as a former policymaker, without understanding policy and geopolitics. So with that, thank you for sticking with me, and I hope that something I said will spur you to give me your opinion, counter or in agreement, or ask a question about anything happening in the global space. I'd be happy to answer it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Meghan. Like last time, we're going to take questions. We do have folks coming around with microphones. I may just use the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question.
Sure.
You mentioned Taiwan, and
Yes.
Curious what your outlook is. We've heard lots of prognostications about the intersection of intent and capability happening in, sometime in 2026, 27. What's your view on that?
Sure. It's a great question. I didn't go too much into it because I was confident that someone would ask me on it, and I'm glad that you did. And this is not to criticize you for being predictable. It's to say this is something I'm sure on the minds of many people in the room. So obviously the tensions around Taiwan have heated up dramatically. And there's a lot of reasons for it. I would say on the one hand, the US repeatedly says it has not changed its policy vis-a-vis Taiwan since the 1970s. I think if I were looking at this from the Chinese perspective, I would say that we still say the same words, but we have moved the goalposts in some significant ways. But I'd say even more important to understanding the question, or the answer to the question that Dan asked, has to do with the Chinese side. That for the longest time since the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party, it has been articulated that Taiwan is a part of China, and the ambition to reconcile these two entities together. Xi Jinping is the first president to actually put a time frame on it, to actually say, this is fundamental to my legacy. It is fundamental to the rejuvenation of the Chinese people, and to ask the military to make sure that it has the capacity to take Taiwan by force, if necessary, by 2027. Now, that doesn't mean that, having the capacity, the US has the capacity to do all kinds of things that we don't do and probably, hopefully, will never do. It doesn't mean that because he said by 2027, that is when it's going to happen. But it puts a time frame, and it puts an ambition on a problem that success had been defined as just keeping the status quo. I went to Taiwan a few days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I did so at the request of the White House. As a former policymaker, sitting policymakers is something that's deeply controversial in the eyes of the Chinese. And I went to talk to them about how they were seeing what unfolded in Ukraine from an Asian perspective, and to get a sense of how they were thinking about their future. And I was also struck that the Taiwanese, I think, increasingly don't see their future as being part of China. There used to be a hope, maybe 10, 15 years ago, that there would be some kind of peaceful reunification, that there would be the one country, two systems type situation that existed in Hong Kong for a while. But with everything that happened in Hong Kong, the Taiwanese are not interested in signing up to that program. So there's just a divorce of interest happening in multiple vectors. So 2027, the Chinese military, at the instruction of Xi Jinping, should have the capability. Now the question is, so I think between now and 2027, we only end up in a conflict if something inadvertent happens, right? Somebody makes a mistake, somebody misinterprets something. That is not likely, but it's certainly not impossible in the kind of environment I've been describing for you. What happens afterwards, I think, that's the period I get more worried about, kind of the after 2027, the turn of 2030, because for the Chinese, they know that America is responding to these changes, and America is making investments that will make it better positioned to potentially and likely assist Taiwan should this scenario come to pass. And so it's in Chinese interest to see that America doesn't have enough time to have all those capabilities unfold. So there's some calculation on the part of the Chinese about when they're going to be, when their military superiority the regional one is going to be, well matched to the United States. So there is some sense that this can't go on for a long period of time. And certainly Xi Jinping, seeing it as central to his legacy, would like to see it in his lifetime and in the period that he's president of China, which I think will be, sometime in the next 15 years.
Okay, question down front.
Some people argue that the era of outsourcing jobs to China and other countries, that led to inequality and economic insecurity, which then led to populism.
Yep.
Like that all fed on. So if that period is over now, and wage gains are running higher now than they have in a long time, this wouldn't happen fast, but are we maybe slowly moving to a period where populism maybe loses some of its oomph because people feel better about their economic prospects?
I think that, I can see your face and you're saying, is this pie in the sky? It's not pie in the sky. I think this is the approach that many US policymakers hope will play out over time. The sense that, yes, actually, China becoming integrated into the global economy, but not respecting all the rules of the global economy, gave it such advantages that did end up hollowing out some American industries and manufacturing sectors. And now a lot of the changes that I described are intended to try to restore some of that competitiveness. And one of the recurring themes of the Biden administration foreign policy is, and this I'm quoting, a foreign policy for America's middle class. So, you go off the coasts into different parts of the United States, there aren't that many people who spend a lot of time thinking about foreign policy, but they are interested in a certain number of things in China, and what this means for their economic well-being is one of them. So I think it will have some interesting effects. I do hope that this move to create more manufacturing, more competitiveness in the United States will have an impact on our societies and on people who have been disadvantaged by globalization over time. And that should affect our politics in a positive way. If you actually look at, I talked about this Inflation Reduction Act piece of legislation, if you look at it and you look at where the intended benefits are going to flow, the projections are that it's going to benefit more red states than blue states, which is kind of ironic because you actually have some Republicans talking about defunding it. But from my perspective, as somebody who identifies with being nonpartisan or bipartisan, from that perspective, hopefully that will generate support for these kinds of initiatives, right? That this will benefit communities. There are provisions in that legislation that actually give benefits to communities that are losing jobs on account of this, which is something we probably should have done a lot more during the era where China was becoming much more integrated into the global economy. It's a great question.
Question in the back.
Is Russia awful for any other reason other than the death of Vladimir Putin? And if he does die, when he does die, or can anything else change their trajectory, is there some other dope behind him that's going to take the same stance? Raging that, I might send off nuclear missiles, which I don't think he ever will. He's got a sauna in a lake house like a lot of other people. I don't see him doing that.
Yeah. I have become very sober about my ability to predict Vladimir Putin's behavior. So right now, when I talk to people who have spent their careers in Russia, studying Russia, they say there really isn't a scenario of a popular uprising or even a palace coup right now in Russia. So the getting rid of Putin right now does look like an act of God, rather than something else. That could change over time. Right now, one of the surprises of the last 18 months is that the Russian economy is actually not doing that badly. My sense is this over time will accumulate, and with it will accumulate dissatisfaction with Putin's rule among the population, but probably even more importantly, dissatisfaction among the group of cronies around him, kind of like the people who actually exercise influence in Russia's economy and political system. And so I don't see an uprising really in the future, though I can always be proven wrong. I see a palace coup as the most likely thing, but I don't see that in the near term. So I think if we're looking ahead, I do see a Russia where Putin is in place. Should a palace coup happen, or should he get struck by lightning? This is actually a scenario that a lot of people are very worried about. It's one of those disconnects in our foreign policy that I wouldn't be surprised if we're all back here in 5 or 10 years' time, we could be talking about why didn't we anticipate that the strategy we were taking vis-a-vis Russia was going to lead to the emergence of this enormous point of instability in the global system. So if you think about it, this is one of the world's largest nuclear weapons state. If you think about how the Russian economy is structured and how the country holds together, it has dozens of autonomous regions that largely are part of the state because Moscow gives them money. If Moscow's no longer in a position to give them money, you start having breakaway regions. You start having a potential dissolution of the Russian state. I'm not predicting that as something that's definitely going to happen. I think it's a higher risk than we take into account right now. And if I'm reading our policy directly right now, and I don't see how we could change it in the short term, but I hope we're thinking about it in the medium term, that as long as there is a single Russian soldier in Ukraine, there will be sanctions on Russia, at least by the United States and by big parts of Europe. And that could take us places that will be very, very unstable right now. As I said, I don't think there is an alternative right now. The short-term goal, which I think is the right goal, is to try to see if there is some capacity to have a discussion that would transform this conflict from dominantly a military one to dominantly a diplomatic one, and that requires pressure on Russia. But an indefinite ostracization of Russia from the West, I think, will have some long-term consequences that will worry us all.
Down in front.
Thank you. Sobering talk. In this John Mersheimer-like great power competition reality that we find ourselves in, you've argued it leads to fragmentation and regionalization with partnerships we've witnessed it and we're witnessing it. What's your take, what's your view on ideological partnerships that may develop? And I'm thinking particularly of BRICS and recent discussions they've had around socialists kind of identifying. I think, honestly, the BRICS might be propping up some of the Russian economy that you alluded to earlier.
Yeah, you're right on that, that the BRICS are certainly propping up the Russian economy. If you look at the flows of energy, and this is like, you know, I talked about government intervention. I gave you some examples. One I didn't give you, and I'll do it quickly now, is the sanctions regime on Russia has reconfigured global energy flows in a way that they would left to the market, oil would not flow in this direction. But we have sanctions, we have a complicated mechanism called the price cap, which is for countries that aren't adhering to sanctions but still want Western insurance and shipping. And so you have oil flowing to places that it normally wouldn't flow in the quantities. You know, India being the biggest example, but also China increasing its importation of Russian oil dramatically in other parts of the global south. So I think going back to your question about the fragmentation and what's the future of the BRICS, in my mind, I guess I use a different terminology, but it's the same thing. I think about middle powers. And so these are countries that are powerful and important and growing and have no interest in really being sucked into one or two of these worlds, like the American world or the China world. And they're BRIC countries, but they're also Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Brazil is a BRIC country. These are countries that are looking to create a space where they can kind of maneuver between the two sides. And this is something that is creating all kinds of new relationships and new challenges. So a good example, I didn't really talk a lot about the Middle East, although there's a lot to say in the context of the trends and transitions I was talking about. So Saudi Arabia, I've been going to Saudi Arabia for 15 or more years. And that US-Saudi relationship has been very, very close with some tensions over time. I just got back from there a month or so ago. That relationship has been transformed by these realities I'm talking about, where basically the Saudis say, we still care about the United States. We want to stay in good terms with it, but we also really care about our relationship with Russia. We need Russia to help manage oil markets. We really care about our relationship with China because China is actually our biggest market. And so, you know, the United States just get used to the idea that we're going to do things that you perceive as counter to your important interest, like cut oil production when President Biden is going into a midterm election, or things along those lines. And so that relationship where there was this consultation and a general understanding that we would try to work together in partnership is completely frayed. And it's up to policymakers on both sides to try to reconceptualize the relationship in a way that it's not destabilizing. But I think you have a whole group of countries, you know, India, again, really, really important, very, very interesting, very resistant to being subsumed on, historically been resistant to being subsumed under an American kind of hegemonic model, but also, not looking to get any closer to China. In fact, looking to safeguard itself against China. A lot of important and interesting dynamics.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm sure we could have gone through a lot more questions, but Meghan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
On behalf
Thank you
of all
all.
of us at Boston
Pleasure
College.
talking to you.